We'll give everyone a few moments and then we will get started. Okay. Looks like we've got a good group to start with, and I'm sure people will trickle in. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Clark, President and CEO of Economic Alliance, Snohomish County, and I am honored to welcome you all to another coffee chat. On this coffee chat, we have some amazing individuals who I will give a brief introduction to and then let them dive in. First and foremost, we're going to have a conversation about housekeeping. So make sure that you add your organizational name to your chat and your feed as you go into chat so that we know who you're with and where you're from. And then please be engaging during the presentation. And this is being recorded. So once we're done, Katie will definitely make sure that it becomes available to you all to view. All right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, we have our special group here. First and foremost, we have Noor Kokiar, who is actually a senior executive with 35 years of experience in Asia, including serving as the country CEO for Cargill in Korea, Japan, and China, the chairman of American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, 2008 and 2009, as well as a leader of the executive groups and a major nonprofit organization in China. Currently serving as the head of the Washington State China Relationship Council, promoting trade, cultural, and education exchanges in China. So we welcome Noor as well. Now, we have two other individuals. I want to just quickly give them their props and updates. We also have Dr. Spencer Cohen. Dr. Spencer is actually from, and this is really awesome, I love the logo, High Peak Strategy. And he founded this organization as an LLC in 2020. It provides a rigorous data-rich analysis that will drive decision-making ranging from business to policy. He is also recognized as an expert on US-China relations, industry analysis, international trade, and ports. Spencer has advanced fluency in Mandarin Chinese, has lived and studied in China and conducted doctoral research there. And last but not least, David Zhou. So we have David here, who actually is a founder and CEO of IM2 China. And I believe that David is actually the first person to give me some info on potential botanical gardens search. So I'm going to check that out in Seattle because of David. David has his organization, which is Seattle-based marketing and consulting firms specialized in supporting global trade or global brands and companies penetrating into the Chinese market, also helping Chinese companies expand into America. He has 20 plus years of helping companies build communications, the bridge between China and the US. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the coffee chat. And I think, Noor, you're going to start off. So,
yep. Thanks, Gary. I'll take it away. So what we want to do today is three things. First, I want to introduce the Washington State China Relations Council. And then I want to make some big picture, like 30,000-foot comments about the US-China relationship and some potential opportunities with China. Then we're going to get down a little more into the weeds, and we're going to have Spencer Cohen, and he's going to present his analysis. So he's going to show us the numbers of the economic ties between Washington State and China. He's going to talk about our rapid growth in exports up until about 2018. Then he'll talk about the cliff we dropped off and what it means for our local economy. And then David is going to talk about his specialty, and that's going to get down in how do you connect to the Chinese market? How do you get your company or your brand known in China? A little more the nitty gritty, so to speak. And then, of course, near the end of the session, we'll be available to take questions. So let me start by talking about the history of the Washington State China Relations Council. Now, you may not think it's really important to know our history, but one of the reasons I'm going to do this is it kind of shows the ebbs and flows or the changes in the relationship between the United States and China. The national relationship, our council relationship kind of tracks that. So in 1979, Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China, came to Seattle on his tour of the US. And that was the year that diplomatic relations were normalized between the US and China. It's also the year when the very first Chinese ship since 1949 came to the United States. And that ship called here in Seattle and loaded a cargo of grain at Pier 86. And as Gary said, I spent my career with Cargill, a grain trading company, and actually Cargill loaded that boat. Local and civic leaders at that time recognized the geographic proximity of Washington to China, the closest state in the mainland to China. And they recognized that there should be an organization to kind of coordinate the relationship. So our organization was started in 1979. It was the first state level organization set up to improve relations between an individual state and China. And it continues obviously to be the oldest state level organization of this type. So for the first 10 years of the organization, the council's existence was focusing on introducing companies to opportunities in the Chinese market. The first executive director of the council was a very energetic former UW professor named Bob Kapp. And he led a number of trips to China where business leaders could experience China firsthand. Key companies back then that were members included companies like Boeing, Weyerhaeuser, and then we had quite a few large banks that were based here in Seattle back then, and they were all supporting members. Going into like the early 90s, Washington companies set up their own operations in China, and they became less dependent on the council to help them with their China introductions. What they needed now was help in Washington, D.C. to ensure that the China market would stay open to U.S. exporters. This was not long after the Tiananmen Square incident. The council provided timely information to legislators in the other Washington about China, about our state's rapidly growing business with China. And such information helped influence Congress to grant China what was called the most favored nation trading status, and later they helped to get China in the WTO. So after China got into the WTO, the council welcomed more and more Chinese delegations to our state. The council became a trusted advisor to both the state government and to various municipalities regarding their dealings with China. In 1993, Jiang Zemin, who was the president of China, visited Seattle. And then again, which the council was a host for that. And again, we hosted the leader of China, Hu Jintao, in 2006 when he made his trip here. I'd like to note that of all the major cities in the US, only Washington, DC, and Seattle have welcomed every sitting Chinese leader. As our China's economy grew, particularly in the 2000s, Chinese companies began to reach out to us to help them consider investments in our region. In the period between 2014 and 2018, Chinese foreign direct investment poured into our region. Many of you may remember some of the big deals that Chinese companies made around here. And for those of you may remember, and those of you who don't know, Columbia Tower, the tallest building in downtown Seattle, was purchased by a Chinese investment group. In 2014, China's prestigious international meeting, their equivalent of what's called the World Economic Forum, or the meeting at Davos, was held outside of China for the very first time, and that was held here in Seattle. The council was a major organizer of that conference. And in the following year, 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Seattle, again when the council was a host for his visit. His visit to the Boeing factory in Everett actually was one of the most publicized events during that trip. In this period, many Chinese companies started to set up operations here in the Puget Sound region, and many of them became members of our council. These included companies like ZTE, Huawei, Hainan Air, and Xiamen Air. We also gained many new members from local real estate companies who were excited about the large number of Chinese immigrants and students buying properties in the region. So I became executive director of the council in early 2019, and I must admit that was terrible timing. As you know, the trade wars set off by the Trump tariffs curtailed Chinese investments, and many of those Chinese companies I just mentioned canceled their memberships and left the council. The local real estate companies, seeing that Chinese investment was drying up, also did not renew their membership. So I guess you might ask, why at this time when the US-China relationship has gotten so full of tension, why would I want to get involved? I lived in China for 18 years, and my thought is that the Chinese people, the Chinese government, know a lot more about the United States than we know about China. The Chinese government has a clear-eyed focus on where they want to take their country, and they have plans to get there. Quite frankly, I think Americans really need to start paying more attention to China, both for the threats and the opportunities that it presents to us. So the council is uniquely positioned to help more people understand China and to educate Washingtons about how closely intertwined our economy is with China's. In addition, I see the mission of the Council is to foster a balanced and nuanced dialogue on the benefits of maintaining a working relationship with China. We need to ensure that the positives of the relationship are not subsumed by the negatives. In this vein, we also have a role to advise and to counsel our members and government officials about their interactions with China. I just note this afternoon, I actually have a call with the governor's office because they have a China issue that they want to talk through with us. So the Council has a history of producing high quality events. Since the advent of the pandemic, everything's gone online, of course. We do webinars just like we are doing this morning. In 2020, we ran about 40, we produced or co-sponsored about 40 webinars on topics ranging from the future of Hong Kong, the outlook for business in China, and we were even able to connect with some doctors, Chinese doctors, who were called to Wuhan when the pandemic first broke out, and they told us their stories. And this year, we've had webinars exploring topics such as the tension in the South China Sea, the emerging tech Cold War between the US and China, and the impact of Chinese investment on local real estate prices. In February, we had our annual gala, of course, online, and we were really pleased that Governor Gary Locke and the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, discussed and debated US policy towards China. In addition to our webinars, we also share information with our congressional delegation on China issues. This year, we canvassed at several trade associations across the state, representing industries like clean tech, tourism, agriculture, and tech, to hear their opinions about China-facing policies that they would like to see passed in Congress. We packaged these positions into a memo that we're soon going to forward to our congressional representatives, as well as our state government. Sadly, our work connecting entities in China with our members here in Washington has virtually come to a standstill. Before COVID, we welcomed many Chinese delegations coming here to look for investments or to invite investments into China. We've done a few of those online, but quite frankly, very, very few at this point. So technically, the Council is what's called a 501c6 organization. So it's a nonprofit membership organization. I'm pleased to say that the Economic Alliance of Snohomish County has been a long-term member. Other current members include companies like Boeing, Microsoft, Starbucks, PACCAR, Costco, and many others. Also, the major law firms in town we count among our members. We also have a number of government entities like the Washington State Department of Commerce and the City of Seattle. I do want to mention, though, that we have individual memberships, and we have a lot of people who have an interest in China. People that might have lived there, done business there, really are just curious about China who are members, and we welcome people to become involved. While the Council, we've traditionally focused on what we call the big picture relationship between China and our state. About a year ago, which is just before the pandemic, we established a sister organization, which we call the Washington State China Relations Fund. And this is a 501c3, a nonprofit charitable organization. And the mission is to provide educational programs and support issues of concern to our local Chinese community. I must say the timing of this was fortuitous. Only weeks after we established this new entity, we were able to use it to import surgical masks at the height of the pandemic. As a nonprofit, we could import the masks duty-free, and then we forwarded them on to both the state government and to some local, some municipal governments. We also used the entity to raise funds to support a joint project with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Tsinghua GIX, and we used the donated funds to purchase meals from Chinese restaurants and donate these to frontline workers in hospitals and clinics. So we plan to use this charitable organization in the future to support more community efforts. And in what we're doing with this organization just next week is we have a webinar about hate crimes against Asians and Pacific Islanders. And the panelists for that event include the Chief of Police of the Seattle Police Force, the head of the Civil Rights Division of our local FBI office, and Lori Matsukawa, who's the former anchor of King 5 News. So that should be a very interesting event. I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but I'll put a plug in here and say that the charitable organization accepts contributions, and all donations made to that are tax deductible. So now let me switch to kind of talk about the current geopolitical situation with China. All Chinese school children are taught that China was embarrassed by the Western nations in what was called China's 100 years of humiliation. This is an era when countries like Britain, the US, and France all had extraterritorial rights or concessions in China. And then in 1930s, of course, Japan invaded China and took over large parts of its territory. So I think we all should realize that the goal of Chinese leadership, ever since the Communist Party came to power in 1949 and they expelled the foreign powers, has been to catch up and to surpass the West. Up until recently, I think China is what we've been biding its time, focusing its efforts on building its economy. In 2008, when the financial crisis struck, the Chinese government launched a massive stimulus plan that built its highways and its high-speed railway network. The Chinese economy continued to grow throughout that 2008-2009 period, while recession gripped most of the rest of the world. I think the Chinese leaders impressed themselves with how well they managed the economy through this crisis, and they came away from this period believing that they really had little more to learn from the West. I think we all look back on 2008 as a real turning point. And from that point onwards, China really began its quest to establish its own world order. The next significant development which impacted the US-China relationship was the coming of power of Xi Jinping. That was in 2012. Xi is from one of the founding families of the People's Republic, and he immediately ramped up propaganda and asserted a more aggressive foreign policy. I believe he also felt that he lost face, or he was rebuffed, when he met with President Obama in 2013, and he basically pitched the idea that the US and China should create a G2 relationship with the two world's most powerful nations, which Obama did not agree to. So I think here we are, 2021, and we now have a very assertive China. One is essentially dismissed US government efforts to address many of the problems of trade and investment that have lingered ever since China joined the WTO. In my opinion, China actually believes the US is in decline, and therefore I think it's going to be more aggressive in trying to paint the US and its allies as unrepresentatives of the hopes and aspirations of the world's population. Big news on the news this morning was that China is flying more and more sorties around Taiwan, so it's definitely getting more aggressive. So my crystal ball does not show a harmonious future for the US-China relationship, at least not in the short term. Let me take a page from former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd of Australia, who spoke at our event. He summed up how he sees the US-China relationship in the future with 3 points. The first is, I think the US must recognize that China is both a strategic competitor for economic and political dominance. This is a situation, quite frankly, where we say, may the best man win. The two countries are going to compete to be the dominant economic power in the world. I'm just going to put a little caveat here and say China will become the world's biggest economy, eclipsing the US probably by 2030 or so. Spencer may correct me on that, but in the not too distant future. And that's basically a fact. China has 3 times, almost 4 times the population of the US, and the people are getting wealthier and wealthier. So China's GDP will exceed the US, but I don't think that's something that we should be particularly scared of or worried about. Second, China and US are going to be adversaries on sensitive issues like human rights and specific territorial issues. Obviously, the US and China disagree over things like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the South China Sea, and many other areas. The best I think that can be done here is that red lines be drawn, so both parties kind of lay out their positions so there are no misunderstandings and that small incidences couldn't turn into a problem or even lead to conflict. And the third element is, they say, China and the US, as the world's 2 largest economies, must collaborate and cooperate in areas of mutual interest. These would be things like climate change and addressing pandemics. It's in the best interest of the world's population that the 2 largest economies cooperate to solve major global issues. So this is not a particularly optimistic outlook, but it's based on what I'd call realpolitik. If we use these 3 points as kind of a blueprint for relations going forward, there is, in my first point, there's an opportunity for business to be done and mutual relations to be carried on. So my last point of my comments is to talk about reestablishing relations with China. With the harsh rhetoric going back and forth between Beijing and Washington, it's a little hard to see through that fog, but there are opportunities today to do business in China. Last week, we had a webinar and we had the leader and some business executives from the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. They were very bullish on their business in China, and several of them said they had record sales in 2020. So again, they have caution about things like intellectual property, but they certainly see that there's big opportunities for American companies in China. Large companies, big tech companies here, they can study basically China's 5-year plans and see where China is headed. And China is very transparent actually about where it wants to take its economy. And its 14th 5-year plan just came out. You can study that and say, gee, these are the 8, 10, 12 industries where they really want to push forward. However, I think most people on the call today are probably from small and medium-sized companies. So let me make a few comments here. When I often talk to people who haven't been to China, they often have a perception that the Communist Party holds the economy tightly in what I'd say it's iron fist, and that companies do exactly what the government says. The truth is, this is far, far from the truth. There's a very thriving private sector in China, and something like 80% of the population in China works in the private sector. When I was in China, I found that the private sector actually was much less regulated than here in the United States. And the leaders of China recognize that their private sector is creating the bulk of the employment opportunities there, and they need this sector to grow. So small and medium companies in China are looking for opportunities to collaborate with foreign companies. They want to bring new products, new services, new ideas to the Chinese market. I'd also like to point out that the incomes of Chinese people continue to improve, and their demand for consumer goods and travel continues to increase. Already the size of the middle class in China exceeds the population of the United States. This means for companies, particularly in the consumer goods sections, that there are many, many opportunities. And the other sector, Chinese tourists, we hope that eventually they will return to our region because they bring good opportunities for local businesses. So 2 weeks ago on Coffee Chats, you had a representative from Scrimbutt Brewery in Everett, and he spoke about his growing exports to China. This is just one example of a company enjoying success in exporting to China. I know of other companies, particularly in agriculture and food, who despite the tariffs are continuing to build their business in China. I cannot predict when the tariffs are going to come off, but the day will come. I think for companies interested in exporting, it's imperative to try to break into the Chinese market now, so that when the tariffs do come off, you'll be ready to go and at full speed ahead. As a quick aside, I'd mention that e-commerce, an easier way maybe to get into business, is booming in China. For small and medium companies, obviously and David might talk about this later, there are definitely opportunities through the e-commerce channel. So again, David's going to talk about how to connect with China, how to promote your products there. I'd also like to mention that there are organizations like the U.S. Export Assistance Center, the Washington Department of Commerce, the Washington State Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, as well as ESAC, and they all have specialists that can help you explore opportunities in the Chinese market. Some of these specialists spoke on a coffee chat just recently and explained how they can help. We also have a number of members, specialist companies that are experts in Chinese market entry. So I encourage you, any of you who have interest in doing business with China, to take full advantages of these services that are available. Okay, so that's probably enough of the general 30,000-foot view and kind of my comments on China and the Chinese market. So what I want to do now is turn to Spencer, and Spencer's going to actually show us some charts and graphs and tell us about the business that Washington State does with China. So Spencer, over to you.
Well, thank you, Noor. And I'm going to share my screen and walk through a few graphs here. Give me a moment. There we go. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Cool, okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks again for the opportunity to participate and share my thoughts on the U.S.-China relationship. And specifically, I'll talk a bit as well about the Washington State-China relationship. So really, what I'll talk about is really, firstly, how has China in the near term done during the pandemic compared to the U.S.? And then what has been the status of our trade relationship, particularly the outcome of the trade war and the phase 1 trade deal, and then look at what else means for Washington State specifically. So what is the current status of the U.S. and Washington State relationship with China? So firstly, looking at the pandemic, China feels like, as much as they definitely made mistakes, and there's a bit of sort of, I would say, bungling and kind of stumbling out the gates with COVID-19, they were able to get a pretty strong grasp of the situation. They're not doing so well with the vaccination right now, actually. The vaccination efficacy rates for their existing vaccines are not very high. And also the rollout's been a bit slower, but they were able to successfully quarantine and control the virus better than most any other country in the world. And you see that in the GDP data. China grew in 2020 at about a clip of about 2.3% in real GDP. The US contracted by about 3.5%. However, China was forecast to grow at about 6.2%. So it definitely was a lot of lost growth opportunity in 2020 because of the virus, but there still was growth. The steepest decline in China's economy was in Q1 when the virus first began to spread in China. It was a contraction of about 6.8% in Q1. A lot of the growth in China, however, has really been supported by government stimulus and also by even more so vast expansion of credit. So Nor mentioned in 2008, 2009, China really deployed a model of stimulus that involved extensive use of bank credit to state enterprises to help to shore up employment. That was really the same model, hasn't really changed. There's been very little change since 2008, 2009 in terms of how China is able to stabilize its economy through the use of state banks, lending money mostly to state enterprises. What we did not see actually was consumer growth. So consumer growth has actually not recovered, despite it has recovered somewhat, but it's still lagging far behind state enterprise growth. And the property market has also seen some increases as well. So that is a large issue China will have to deal with, and they are trying to begin to control some of that, a lot of unregulated expansion of credit in the economy. So we'll see how that plays out in 2021. The government has also loosened its controls for GDP. So China for a long time had very established growth targets every year for what it wanted to grow or what its target growth rate was. And that's actually finally, for the first time in many years, actually been loosened to an approximate. First, they opted not to have a growth target, and then they kind of reverted back to a quasi-target of give or take around 6%. So we'll see how that goes. So China, this is a story I think many of us already know, but China has certainly become the major trade partner of the US. We've seen the US-China goods trade, including imports and exports, increase in real terms about 400% between 2000 and 2018. Overall world trade over that same period grew about 50%. A lot of that has to do with shifting of supply chains, increased movement of goods, production to China from the US and from other parts of the world. And of course, also China's entry into WTO in 2001 helped to expedite a lot of those processes. But you can see the vast increase over that period. China now representing a significant portion of overall US trade, mostly on the import side, but also on the export side as well. So that's a consistent trend we've seen over time. And just the growth has been pretty phenomenal over until the last few years. Now, one of the big stories that gripped the economic news and the media with respect to US-China relationship ever since 2018 was the trade war. And the trade war started in 2018 with invocation of what's called 232, which is part of the US trade law that allows US president to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, or any goods actually, originally for national security purposes around steel and aluminum. And then using the US Trade Act of 1974, President Trump was able to further escalate and apply escalated tariffs on other Chinese goods for reasons of unfair trade practices in China. Now, a lot of the motivation behind the trade war was actually quite justified historically. So China did not have a great record when it comes to intellectual property rights protection. China still has a very large state sector and a large amount of industrial subsidies. China has many other ways of interfering in the market, and also importantly, restricting access historically for US products and other foreign products entering China. But for the Trump administration, I think the fatal flaw in terms of their approach was twofold. One was the motivation to address a trade deficit. And the common belief in the Trump administration, or at least publicly, was that bilateral trade deficits are a sufficient target, or the appropriate target for dealing with bilateral trade issues. And it is my view, and many others, that trade is a very multilateral activity. So we know that a lot of products that are manufactured in China are simply the final assemblage of products, of higher value products that are manufactured elsewhere, including Japan, Korea, South Korea, Germany, and elsewhere. So trade, maybe in the many decades earlier, trade was a very bilateral activity, but nowadays trade is a multilateral activity, and therefore bilateral trade deficits are not a very useful indicator or metric of that relationship. The second flaw was that the administration believed that pursuing a bilateral approach, or unilateral approach, I should say, to dealing with China's unfair trade practices was the best approach. But because trade is a multilateral activity, we did not have the heft and the involvement of our other trade partners in bringing constructive pressure on China to reform those practices. And in many cases, which I'll talk a bit about with the phase one trade deal, it really just shifted some of the pain to some of our trade partners as a zero-sum approach to dealing with China. And what we saw was that, as the administration focused on a bilateral trade deficit with respect to goods, this doesn't include services, I should clarify, we didn't really see much of a change even during the trade war. The administration applied tariffs on Chinese goods. There was some reduction, but overall, we still managed a very high trade deficit with China over that period. The other important point is that when you do apply tariffs, as we've seen much in the media, it's a tax, and it's a tax on U.S. households and final consumers of Chinese goods. And many of the products that are manufactured in China do not have an easily available substitute. So many of the types of textile goods, other kinds of products, even more advanced products, don't have alternative sources for those products, especially in the short run. So it ends up becoming a tax on U.S. households and also U.S. importers, such as various kinds of manufacturers who import components from China. So the cost was ultimately really borne by U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses. And that's why many U.S. businesses have been very much opposed to the trade war. The other element is that China, in its retaliation in the trade war to escalated U.S. tariffs, raised tariffs on U.S. goods. And that effect both hurt U.S. exporters, especially Washington state companies that rely on China as a major market because it weakened their competitiveness. And it also shifted the tariff burden, as we saw that as the U.S. tariff, the average tariff rate on U.S. physical goods increased during the course of the trade war up to on average about 22%. We saw that the rest of the world actually saw a relative reduction in the average rate that they faced in the Chinese market. So we're actually potentially shifting market share away from U.S. exporters to other countries around the world to their benefit. So again, disadvantaging U.S. companies. So even though the underlying principles or purposes behind the trade were probably well-founded, the approach was very haphazard and not effective. Now, the resolution of the trade war was what was called the phase one trade deal, which was signed on January 15th of 2020, which was unfortunately right before COVID-19. So it's hard to evaluate the efficacy of the deal per se, but in my view, as I mentioned before, the deal had a basic fundamental flaw in its approach to trade as a bilateral relationship in the 21st century. What we saw in the trade deal, the phase one trade deal, was that China had agreed to increase its imports of US goods and services by about $200 billion over 2017 levels over the next 2 years. Of course, because of COVID as a major contributing factor, we did not see that kind of increase, even though we did see actually fairly steady importation of Chinese goods into the US market. So we had expected, just in terms of the goods side, that by the end of 2020, the US would have seen an export level of $154.4 billion in exports to China, physical goods, including aircraft, commodities, other kinds of ag goods. We're roughly about half of that, about $89.4 billion. COVID, again, was certainly part of the issue because of disruption in supply chains, but really the bigger issue was the unrealistic goals, I believe, and the sort of fatal construction or concepts or motivations behind the deal itself were going to ensure that it was not going to be successful in the long run. So why does this all matter for Washington State? And I'll share some of the statistics on Washington State's trade relationship with China. So Washington State benefits from this trade relationship really in three fundamental ways historically. Firstly, China is a major market for Washington State goods, physical goods that actually are manufactured products that are developed or manufactured in Washington State and sold to the Chinese market. Of course, the most well-known in Snohomish County is aircraft. China has been until recently, was a major market for Boeing aircraft. China is the largest foreign market for Boeing, and historically about 20% of Boeing's overall sales over the past 10 years or so have been China. Washington State is also a major manufacturer of ultrasound equipment, again, manufactured in Snohomish County, especially as China becomes a more affluent society and it ages as well. We've seen that there's been growing demand for more advanced medical equipment. But we're also major exporters of frozen French fries. We're the largest exporter in the country of frozen French fries to China. Chinese consumers will pay a very high premium for Northwest cherries. Those are air shipped, and they're willing to pay a 3x premium for those products, as well as many other kinds of agricultural commodities. However, what's not captured as easily in the trade data are services, and Washington State is a major exporter as well of services to China. These are non-physical goods that would include software royalties, architecture services. Lots of architectural work in China has been done by Washington State architecture firms like Mulvaney G2, Callison, and others. We also export legal and professional services. And then anytime a Chinese student, which there are many, spends money on tuition at the University of Washington or other universities, WSU and so forth, in Washington State, that is also technically an export. And then lastly, there's tourism. So whenever a Chinese national actually spends money in Washington State, even if it's, it's a foreign national, spends part of their disposable income on goods and services in Washington State, or a restaurant, or what have you, that is also an export. And then lastly, Washington State is a major handler of marine cargo between the US and China. Even though the vast majority of that cargo, import and export, is not either destined or originating in Washington or from Washington State, the very handling of that cargo is a high value activity that generates many, many jobs across the economy. And we know that marine cargo handling in the US or in Washington State global trade supports roughly about 100,000 jobs, including freight forwarding and longshore stevedore activities and so forth, and intermodal activities. And China being roughly about a third of all Washington State containerized cargo really is a major driver of those very strong, good paying jobs in Washington State. So over the past years, we saw that these are inflation adjusted for comparison. And we saw that in 2015, Washington State goods exports reached a historic high in 2020 dollars of about $15.5 billion. Now you can see that aerospace is the largest component historically for the Washington State exports to China. In 2015, aerospace exports summed to about $12.4 billion. That held fairly steady until 2019, when exports dropped to about $2.8 billion, and then aerospace exports fell to $1.1 billion. However, we did see that even though, what's not immediately apparent is that even despite the trade war, and we did see some notable declines in non-aerospace exports in 2019, there was a rebound in 2020. We did see that non-aerospace exports, such as various ag commodities, such as Washington State wheat, cherries, ultrasound equipment, and so forth, did experience a boost from $2.1 billion up to $2.4 billion over that period. So roughly about a 16% increase, which is fairly consistent with overall US export growth to China in 2020. However, the story really is the decline in aerospace exports over that period. Now, with respect to aerospace exports, the big story, it's not perfectly aligned with those export data, but the new orders of Boeing aircraft really is not directly a response to or an outcome of the trade war. Boeing aircraft were not included on the list of China's retaliatory tariffs. And again, there could be some fluctuations in terms of the replacement of fleets. Hopefully this will increase. And we did see, but we hope to expect in 2021 to see an increase in uptick in new orders, because those orders are an important driver of Boeing's overall sales in Washington State. And there are still 143 existing backlog orders as of December of 2020. So even though we're not getting new orders, I have not received many new orders, those existing orders are still being processed. They're still generating income into the state because of the transactions and because of the sale of those aircraft. Now, just to touch on some of the leading exports and how they fared throughout the trade war from Washington State. These are the largest non-aerospace exports from Washington State, physical goods exports from Washington State in 2017, and comparing them to right before the trade war and comparing them to levels in 2020 in adjusted dollars. And you can see that, for instance, timber, for instance, was a major export of about $316 million in 2017, Washington State timber. That fell down to about $100 million. Medical devices, I mentioned, actually has seen some growth. It did fall in 2018, 2019, but picked up again in 2020, up to about $400 million. And then we also saw a sizable increase from about $130 million up to about $300 million in 2020. So it's a bit of a mixed story. Again, a lot of these exports did suffer a little bit during the trade war. We did see some notable declines in overall non-aerospace exports during the trade war because of the increase in retaliatory tariffs by China on many of these products. But since China did sign the Phase 1 trade deal, China has been intent, at least on trying to, at least before COVID, they were intent on trying to meet many of the requirements and stipulations in the trade deal. And so there is an expansion of trade between the US and China. So they did remove or lower a lot of those tariffs to try to improve that on many of these products. So we did see some increases. But again, there's many other mitigating factors as well. And then lastly, with respect to cargo, we've seen that total weight. So we're looking at here is the total weight of cargo handled at Washington State ports, which includes our ports, ports that belong to the Northwest Seaport Alliance, as well as at Grays Harbor, which handles a lot of automobiles, and then also the river ports that handle a lot of commodities such as soybeans and grain. And so we see that with respect to marine cargo, China still, there was a large increase in trade going back to 2003, which is as far back as the data goes. And then a sudden drop as we saw in 2018, because again, in 2019, less so in 2019 because of the trade war, because this is cargo that's being handled at Washington State ports, but is originating or coming from or going to other parts of the US, but again, generating lots of income for Washington State. So we did see a sizable decline in, in 2019 with some rebound afterwards, 2018, 2019 in total vessel cargo. Containers, however, have continued to decline. From 2018 down to 2019, we've seen continued decline in container traffic. Again, tied to the trade war and to COVID as well. So containers imports are down 15% in 2020 compared to last year, and they're down 32% compared to 2018. So again, this is really important because even though this is products for the most part that do not go to Washington State consumers or come from Washington State companies, they help to generate lots of other wealth because Washington is providing a service for the rest of the country or large parts of the country as far east as Chicago in handling those imports and exports. So I'll pause there. I know I want to leave time for David Joe, and then I will share during the Q&A some comments about and some opinions about where I see the trade relationship going and overall relationship as well to US and China in the near future, but I'll wait till our Q&A section for that. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach me at spencer@highpeakstrategy.com. I'll turn it to David.
Hey, David.
Yeah, thank you, Spencer. And it's really good presentation with full of data. So I agree with Noah's opinion that there are opportunities. There are always opportunities, between China and the US, especially for the US company. If you want to export your products to China or the economic development organizations, if you want to acquire Chinese investors, put their money to the US market and open the factory here and generate new jobs here, there are tons of opportunities. Even during the pandemic in the past year, personally, I saw, because I have lots of customers around the country, a state level, county level, I saw at least 5 large projects from China. These FDI projects and they settled into the United States. Even though the US government stopped issue visa to the to the Chinese businessmen, they still found some relationship with US general consuls in China, in Shanghai and in Guangzhou. They get visa and they send people from China fly to the United States during the pandemic, and the money flow in. Yeah, so the news that we read on US newspaper and the news that Chinese business people read on the Chinese newspaper versus the reality, there's some gap. There's a gap. Yeah, so my opinion is that some Chinese company, they really value the US market, and they found their own methodologies, their channels to put money into the US because they focus on the business. They are not political people, they focus on the business. Yeah, so some of our customers ask me that, oh, what kind of the Chinese company they are still be interested with the US market. I told them that three type of companies that you may want to focus on. First is the company in China. If 60 or even more than 60 of their business exporting to the global market, US is the #1 international market for those companies. For example, the manufacturers of furniture, of the carpet, hardwood floor, the kitchen equipment, the bathroom equipment, such kind of the stuff. Almost everything is made in China. Those manufacturers, they are eager get into the US market. If you found the right person to talk with, and they will say that, oh, I'm waiting for this opportunity for a long time, but they don't know where to go. They don't know what's the difference between Washington State versus Oregon versus California. They don't know whether they should deal with the state government versus the county government versus the federal government. They don't have clear picture about the tax benefit, tax incentive program, by different states. They have no such kind of knowledge. Yeah, the second type of the company is the China-based company, but they rely on the natural resources. For example, oil, gas, wood pulps. The China made paper, so they import all kinds of the wood products into China to make paper. Yeah, so such kind of companies, it's easy for them to set branch offices and acquire some facilities in the United States, because the US major source for China to import those products, the natural products. And the third one is relevant with technology. So that category has been hurt seriously in the past 3 years because of the trade war, because of the tough relationship, between China and the US. But still, for some insensitive technologies, for example, it's very, very hot in China for the electric vehicles, batteries. That is super hot. And lots of the company in China, they want build up the joint ventures and build up the partnership with US companies, so that is a huge opportunity. Clean energy, regenerable energy, solar products, and wind, electric generators, such kind of technologies. And agriculture, the greenhouse and indoor farm, that is super hot in the United States. And also, high demand in China because the huge population and the limited land in China. So agriculture, anything relevant with agriculture, technologies and innovations, Chinese people, they will put money on it and they will get eager into it. So the question is that we see the opportunities, and how can Snohomish County, Greater Seattle region, and the state of Washington catch those opportunities? How can our companies local here, we can deliver the message to the Chinese investors, say that, oh, come here, come to Seattle, and you will find what you need. So that is my couple of charts that I want to share with you. Let me see, how can I share my screen? Okay, here it is. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, great. Yep. So yeah, it is a communication pyramid that we suggest our customer to pay more attention. Yeah, so everyone focus on top. Top is the deals. They say that the contracts, the FDI, the Chinese investors come here, already signed the contracts. So people like to start from the stage, from this stage, the color of yellow, and because it is very close to reach the deal. So I saw that happened in the past 10 years. There's so many US local economic development organizations and the companies, they travel to China. They join the trade shows and attend the international conference, and they have a great dinner and group picture with the Chinese partners and the drink together. They feel that, oh, we build up the strong relationship. And when they come back to the United States, they ask me that, oh, why they did not answer my email. 3 months later, 6 months later, 1 year later, there's no result. And next year they come back to China. Oh, they drink together again. They shake hands. They say that, oh, we are the best of friends. And then there's no result. Why? Because build up the relationship is important. It's quite important, but it's not the only reason for the Chinese people to make a business investment decision. And they need information. They need to understand who you are, what you can offer, what's the difference between your offering versus your peers. So my suggestion is start from bottom, start from the foundation. You need to have the Chinese content ready. You need to let people know who you are, what you can offer, what's advantage in Snohomish County, in Seattle area. And what's the difference between Seattle versus Los Angeles versus San Francisco versus Chicago versus New York? What's the difference between the state of Washington versus Oregon versus Texas? Yeah, so if the Chinese people, they cannot find the Chinese content on the internet, they go Baidu to do some search, then they cannot find you. What they say is that, oh, come to Georgia, come to North Carolina, come to South Carolina. There are hundreds of the Chinese companies here. So they will put their interest on those areas that we call those regions are China ready. But the state of Washington, to be honest, is not China ready yet. So start from the Chinese content, and then you need to find the right channel to deliver the message to the Chinese audience. Start with the paid media. So that means advertising, sponsor stories, sponsor some events, and do some PRs, spend some money and deliver the message to the target audience. And leverage the PR, leverage the news, leverage the local relationship activities. You will earn some traffic to read your message. So we call that is earned media. The most important and the cheap media is owned media. That is your website, is your social media, your WeChat account, your Toutiao account, your a TikTok account. Yeah, so when you have a stable audience for your own media, that will grow organically. So the value of the three media channel is to increase the share of voice of your brand in the China market. So that is quite important. And then on top of that is to build the business connections and the personal connections. Yeah, so there are lots of debates that we don't have a Chinese speaking representative. And how can we build up the business connections? For those Chinese companies, if they like to go abroadly, if they really like to make investment to the United States, they have pretty good English speaking staff already. So English communication is not a big issue, but the foundation is that whether we can build up the trust or not. So the big business connection and the personal connection, those relationship, friendship, actually is to build up the trust. To build up the trust, you need to be open. You need to show them that what is we can offer to you. So to create opportunity to generate the win-win situation. Yeah, so that is also get back to the foundation. So whenever you have your offering in Chinese content and then go through the right media to reach the right audience to build up the business relationship and the personal relationship, you are very prepared for the people person-to-person meetings, to visit China. So that is something that you can get a solid result from. So it is my opinion, we saw so many customers in the United States, not only in the US, but also in Canada, from Europe, from Israel, from Australia. They are not very patient. They jump to this step. They jump to step 7. Yeah, so they are eager to build the person to schedule the personal meetings, the face-to-face meetings, and to buy an air ticket and travel to China. So, and then they say that if I saw some opportunities, if I saw some money flow from China to the United States, then I will translate my website into Chinese. I will set up my WeChat account. I will hire a Chinese speaking, I will hire your Chinese speaking representative. But that what if is always, create a story that eliminate your actions, eliminate the opportunities. So if you live in such kind of the what if situation, and you will never get a result. So I want to share with you an example that is also my customer, is state of Georgia. State of Georgia has been my customer for over 6 years. So actually 7 years. Wow, this time flies. And you can see that what the state of Georgia did target the Chinese market. First of all, they have the Chinese website. And we registered this website and hosted in China. So there's no firewall issue. And you can see that their URL is georgiabusiness.cn. And we make the translation of the content from English website and into the Chinese language. But the state of Georgia's the IT department, they have the controller right, and they update the content by themselves. But we only do the host. And we register the WeChat account for them. They have 2 WeChat accounts. One is dedicated for the tourism bureau. Another is for the economic development. And in weekly basis, we have the articles publishing. So you can see this screen of their WeChat. Just to give you some examples, on March 11th, and we have an article talk about this China-based company. It's a Spring Mountain Center, invest $45 million and build a manufacturer outside of Georgia, outside of Atlanta. yeah, in Georgia. So actually, it is a real example that this company start negotiation with state of Georgia during the pandemic and early of this year, and they make the final decision. They select North Carolina, South Carolina, and Texas and Georgia as the 4 candidates, and they send a delegation to visit those sites, and finally they send the contract with state of Georgia. Yeah.
Hey, David.
So,
yep. Hey, David, this is Gary. I apologize for interrupting. I just want to make sure that we give everyone enough time to close here.
Sure,
we didn't give you ample time to get through your presentation. So I think what we'll do is, if everyone's open to this, I think it's an opportunity for us to have a part 2 of this to dive a little deeper, if you're willing, David, to come back, and our other panelists, if you guys feel comfortable with that. I think this has been a robust conversation. We really want to get to the point where we can have maybe just a Q&A with you all and our members and investors, just to have a conversation, especially our businesses that have questions about the relationship between China and America, and how we can continue to build that relationship. But final thoughts, David, before we wrap up?
Yeah, so our suggestion is that you need to get ready before you really want to get a China investment. But get you ready is not difficult, you know, to have the China-based information, to have the Chinese-speaking representative, to have your website and your videos and your brochures localized in Chinese language, and choose the right partner and the right channel, deliver it to the China market. That is the right way to start with. So someone also asked me the question that, oh, I'm only one hotel with 300 rooms. I'm just a small size, a medium sized company. You know, we don't have enough money to support such kind of the big marketing events. So that is a value for the economic alliance of Snohomish County, you know, for Greater Seattle Partners, for WICRC. Those organizations actually, they can consolidate small individual companies' resources together to generate the leads and benefit the whole region. Yeah, so that is my suggestion, that if individual company organization, you don't have enough resources, you can join, you know, sponsor the local economic development organization. You know, that can change the whole picture. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you, Noor. I also want to, let's see, we got Spencer here as well. And I want to thank all of the folks who stayed on just a few minutes over our normal allotted time, but I think was definitely worthwhile. We will try to bring you all back as soon as we can. But a quick update, April 20th, we are going to have a coffee chat on post-pandemic online world. And I think coming from this presentation from David and the rest of the folks on the panel, we realized that we have a lot to converse about as far as business relationships. So David, thank you so much for the presentation. I want to also thank Noor. I want to make sure that Spencer as well has understood that you all did a great job. So with that being said, everyone raise your coffee cups and have a great day. Thanks for another coffee chat with the Economic Alliance, Snohomish County. Take care.
Okay, thank you.